How many have ever heard of Larry Nassar? Larry Nassar was basically a doctor who was in charge of a lot of the girls that were gymnasts. And Larry Nassar was arrested because many of the girls that would go see him, as you know the story, he molested many of them. But what sticks out is one particular story about this father and his two daughters. His two daughters had been molested by this doctor, and you could go on YouTube and watch this video, but they had the court scene, which you could see up here to the right. There is the father at the top with his two daughters that had been molested. And the judge allowed the father to speak, and he said to the judge, "Judge, could you please give me 5 minutes with this guy? Just give me 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." Well, he wanted to pummel him, of course. Well, the judge in the background said, "You cannot do that." And so immediately the father took off and he ran towards Larry Nassar, this supposed doctor that molested his two daughters. And of course, it was total pandemonium in the courthouse. They had to restrain him, they had to put him on the ground. Well, in the end, they never arrested the father. They didn't press charges against him. Now, if you're a parent, you can understand, especially if you have daughters or a daughter, you can understand the sentiment and the feeling of this father, why he would want revenge. Have you ever wanted revenge against someone else? Have you ever wanted your pound of flesh? Maybe somebody wronged you verbally, physically, emotionally. Maybe somebody wronged you on social media. That's a popular thing today. When people get behind a keyboard, they say a lot of things that are often hurtful. I think we all have had those feelings where we wanted to seek revenge. If not physically, at least mentally, we fantasize about revenge. Well, that's what I want to talk about this evening. In Genesis chapter 34, we're going to see Jacob's sons are going to seek revenge on behalf of their sister who was potentially raped, as we'll see as we go through the narrative. So turn, if you will, to Genesis chapter 34. Now, if you remember from the last chapter, Jacob has left Padan Aram, which was 500 miles north. He went up there, met his wives, had all of his children, and God finally called him to go back to the promised land. He ends up meeting his brother Esau, who he was at enmity with, and he finally reconciles with his brother. And if you notice the map, it says at the end of the chapter, the previous chapter, that Jacob ended up settling here with his family in Shechem. This would be the area of the promised land. And if you remember, God had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and all of their descendants that they would inherit the promised land. If you want to see a picture here, here is a modern day picture of Shechem. You notice the valley right here in the middle. And so they're in the land of Shechem. This is the land of Canaan. It is a pagan area. And here they exist as sort of a small tribe. The nation of Israel hasn't exploded at this point in terms of population growth. That's not going to happen until they go to Egypt, where they are incubated and they're able to exponentially grow as a nation. So with that background, let's pick up in chapter 34 as we look at Jacob's sons seeking vengeance. It says, "Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah." Now remember, Leah was Jacob's least favorite wife, and he only had one daughter. Her name was Dinah. And it says, "Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the daughters of the land." That would be the daughters of the area of Shechem. Now obviously she was the only girl, and she had probably no friends at this point. She had 12 brothers. And so she's venturing out of her little area to go meet probably some girls who lived within the culture of Shechem. Now here's what we don't know, the text doesn't tell us. Was this a regular thing that she did? Or was it a one-time event where she went out of curiosity or out of a desire to make friends? We don't know if it was regular or a one-time event. Furthermore, was it done out of rebellion? She was going there not just out of curiosity, but she was going there because she was attracted to the worldliness of the Shechemites that lived there, or was it a legitimate desire simply to make friends? We really don't know. But let's take both for example. If it was rebellion, then obviously this was wrong, and this is going to set her up to get into a compromising situation. You know, this happens today with our children, especially in this generation. Our children can sometimes wander away from the family base, and what happens is they wander into areas that they should not wander into. They end up befriending boys and girls that they should not befriend, and what happens is, because of their rebellion, they end up taking on the customs of this world. And that's why as parents, it's so important that we keep a tight rein on our children. Now, obviously, we need to give them a modicum of freedom commensurate with their age. We don't want to over-control them. But at the same time, as parents, we have to be intentional about who our children are hanging around with. Because if she had a wandering heart, if she had a rebellious attitude, Jacob should have been more proactive in this. Although parents can be proactive, and I think we all know, because I've experienced this, children will do their own thing. And so we got to be careful. Now, if she was going out of pure motive, this was an unfortunate situation, but she probably shouldn't have been flirting with the system, as it were, the Canaanite culture, because we know that culture was a very debauched culture. It was a very degrading culture. And so, notice what has happened when, in verse 2, when she wanders to this particular area. It says, when Shechem, now Shechem would be the son here, the son of Hamor. And it's interesting, that word Hamor or Hamor, the word in the Hebrew literally means male donkey. That was his name. Now, you and I would see that as a pejorative term, but in that day, it actually was a compliment, because donkeys in that day were prized possessions based on the culture. It says, when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, now who were the Hivites? The Hivites were one of the 7 nations that lived in the land of Canaan. They're mentioned in the book of Deuteronomy, I believe, chapter 7. And you're going to find later on in the book of Joshua that the Hivites are going to give the Israelites problems. That's why when Israel became a nation and Moses delivered them out of Egypt, God told the Israelites, when you go back into the land of Canaan, I want you to drive out the inhabitants of the land, and I want you to destroy them, because their sin had reached a fever pitch, and God was using the Israelites as an instrument to judge the Canaanites. And so this is sort of a foreshadow of what's going to happen in the future. And so here we have this boy. His name is Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite. And notice it calls him the prince of the land. That means his dad was a chieftain or a ruler. And so Dinah is visiting this area of Shechem, whether it was one time, whether it was regular, we don't know. But what happens is he locks eyes on her. She probably was attractive because she looked different. She was Hebrew. And so it says he took her and he lay with her by force. In other words, he had sex with her. Now, isn't it interesting that people that are in prominent positions of power often abuse other people? That's not true of everyone who's in leadership, but you will find often pagan rulers and the sons of pagan rulers, they often abuse those who are vulnerable. I remember years ago I saw a documentary on the life of Saddam Hussein. And his sons were out of control because their father was out of control. But one of the things they said in the documentary about Saddam Hussein's sons was not only did they have a lot of money and a lot of power, but one of the things they would do, particularly I believe the older one, is when he saw a girl that he was very attracted to, he would rape her. In fact, he did this to one particular girl of a prominent family. And because the father protested, he took the father outside and he bludgeoned him to death. It was a horrible thing. And of course, both of them died in a brutal way. They were riddled with all kinds of bullets. And as you know, Saddam Hussein was hung in effigy. Especially in that culture, it was very shameful the way his death ended up. But here is a person, here's a son. He has a position of power, a position of leadership. And what is he going to do? He locks eyes with this particular girl, and he decides to have sex with her. Now, it says here that he took her by force. Now, there's two views on this, according to Hebrew scholars and commentators, in relation to what he did to her. The first view is the traditional view, and that is this: he raped her. That simply means he took her by force. Now, this was probably a common practice in the land of Canaan, and maybe it was common among the leaders of the Shechemites, and so they probably would have not have seen this as anything that was reprehensible. Now, why did he do this if it was rape? Well, we know that men who like to rape women, they're typically driven by lust, they're driven by control, they are insecure, and it's an issue of power. If that's the case here, the reason he raped her was not only was he lusting after her, and not only was he attracted to her, but it was an issue of power. And you and I know rape goes on in our culture all the time. It goes on daily, and it is a horrible crime because it damages the individual psychologically, physically, and emotionally. I don't know if you all watched the news today, but did you see that Harvey Weinstein was sentenced to 23 years in prison? And as you know, several women came forward and said that he had raped them. In fact, in the court, here is what one woman said who was the victim of Harvey Weinstein. Quote, "I believe that if Harvey Weinstein was not convicted by this jury, it would happen again and again and again." She said, "Rape is not just one moment, but it is forever," end quote. And so it happens in our culture today, and this is a view that many people believe is the theme here of chapter 34. But there is a second view, which is a non-traditional view, and it says this: he engaged in simply premarital sex. In the first view, it was forced. In this particular view, it was consensual. In other words, the idea was she was visiting there for a period of time, and they were both interested in one another, and they ended up having a sexual tryst. They hooked up, as we would say today. Now you say, well, if that's the case, why did her brothers get so angry? If it was simply consensual sex, why would they have gotten so angry? I mean, we can understand their anger if it was a rape situation, but why would they be so incensed if it was consensual sex between Shechem and their sister Dinah? Well, you have to understand, in that cultural, it was very unacceptable to engage in premarital sex. It was taboo. And furthermore, Shechem bypassed the normal process of what they would call in that day a betrothal. That was a very important process. Now, there's an individual by the name of Lynn Betchel, and she believes this argument was he did not rape her, but they actually engaged in premarital sex. And I want you to look at her quote up on the screen because I believe she gives a pretty compelling argument. And here is what she says. Upon hearing the news about his daughter, Jacob is at first silent. As we go through the text, we're going to see Jacob didn't say anything. Then he negotiates Dinah's marriage to Shechem. If Dinah has been raped, Jacob ignores his obligation to protect the woman of his household and ignores Dinah's suffering. She says this seems peculiar. Does it suggest that Dinah was not raped? In the Hebrew Scriptures, rape is generally indicated by a cry for help from the woman, showing lack of consent, and violence on the part of the man, indicating a forcible, hostile act. But the intercourse of Shechem does not fit this pattern. Genesis 34:2 reports that he sees Dinah, takes her. The Hebrew word for take is often used for taking a wife, lies with her, and then it says he shames her. This author goes on to say the NRSV combines the last two verbs, rendering lay with her by force. And notice this reading is contested in the Hebrew. In other words, it's disputed whether or not he took her by force. Then the text, verse 3, provides three expressions of affection. First, it says he bonds with her, then that he loves her, And finally, that he speaks tenderly to her. That seems odd for someone who just raped somebody. From this description, the author goes on to say, Shechem appears to be a man in love, not a man committing an exploitative act of rape. Rapists feel hostility and hatred towards their victim, not closeness and tenderness, end quote. We see an example of this with Amnon. Remember one of David's sons? What did he end up doing? He ended up raping one of David's daughters, Tamar. Remember, he wanted her real bad, and it seemed like he was attracted to her, but he really was experiencing lust. And after he rapes her, and he's able to have his way with her, what does he do? He pushes her away, and he wants nothing to do with her. He disdains her. And so that seems to be the pattern here in Genesis 34. Now you say, well, which view is the right view? I really don't know, to be honest with you. I think both views have compelling arguments towards them. So as we go through the text, I'm going to use both positions, and obviously when we get to heaven, we'll find out. But either way, the brothers wanted their vengeance. They wanted their pound of flesh because they felt what Shechem did was wrong. So notice verse 3. It says he was deeply attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the girl and spoke tenderly to her. Again, this seems to imply that a rape did not happen. Now, if a rape did happen, obviously this guy is psychologically twisted. He rapes her, then he is tender towards her in order to reassure what he says is love towards her. But if it was a rape, you and I know there was no love there. It was strictly lust. And you know, here's a good principle. When you mistreat other people, when you abuse other people, whether it be physically, whether it be emotionally, whether it be verbally, you cannot expect them to give love in return to you. You know, rapists have this erroneous idea that they can rape a girl and then turn around and try to show them love and affection. Well, listen, that's going to be absolutely repugnant to that woman. But that principle carries over. If you're in a marriage and you're verbally abusing your spouse all the time and you're totally neglecting them, you know what? They're not going to receive your overtures of love. Why? Because you have hurt them emotionally. So notice verse 4. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, he told him on, get me this young girl for a wife. Now, why would he go to the father? Because in that day, marriages were arranged primarily through the father. And what the father would have to do is go to the potential father of the spouse, and he would have to pay a bride price. Now, if you were in a Jewish culture and you raped a woman, God commanded that you automatically marry them and pay a big fine. Now, I realize that if he did rape her here and it wasn't consensual sex, then obviously the laws of Judaism would not have applied to Shechem because he was in the Canaanite land and he was a pagan. But if you had a Jewish man who raped a Jewish woman, God gave a stiff penalty. Notice what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 22. It says, if a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married, in other words, she's single, and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. That was a pretty stiff price in that day. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. You say, well, that's fine and dandy, but what about the poor woman who has been raped? I mean, how many of you ladies, God forbid, if you were raped, would want to marry your rapist? And so skeptics have often used this passage to say, what kind of God would allow this? And I'm not going to serve a God that is going to basically require a woman to marry her rapist. Well, you have to understand in that day, if a woman was raped, it was very disadvantaged to her. In other words, there was a stigma attached to a woman who was raped. She was considered pariah. She was considered somewhat of an outcast. This is what happened to Tamar when she was raped. And so, God here, in a sense, is providing mercy to the woman. Now, understand this. God is not requiring that woman that was raped to have ongoing intimate relationships with the man that raped her. That's not what God is requiring here, because no woman is going to want to be sexually intimate with a man who raped her. But what God is doing here as an act of mercy, because that woman would be isolated, is he's basically commanding that the man has to support her the rest of her life. You say, yeah, but what if she wants to remarry? Again, in Jewish culture, it was a stigma. She probably would not have been remarried. And so God is commanding that the man support her the rest of his life. And so notice verse 5. Now Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah, his daughter. How did he find out about this? We really don't know. Probably some of the girls within the Shechemite culture probably told Jacob. It doesn't say how he found out. But his sons were with his livestock in the field, so Jacob kept silent until they came in. Now, why did he keep silent? He didn't say anything. He thought about it. He mulled it over. He probably wanted to consult with his sons. Now, Dinah was probably a teenager, no doubt, and probably his sons were in their 20s. Now, typically, whenever a person is wronged, whenever you are wronged by somebody else, whenever you are hurt, there's two responses that you and I can have. The first response is reflection, patience, seeking wise counsel. That's probably the wisest thing to do biblically. We need to think about what happened. We need to pray about it. But there's a second response that many of us fall into, and that is rage. Depending on the nature of the offense, if the offense is very hurtful, if the offense is very painful, especially if it involves one of your children, I've often thought to myself, I don't know what I would do if someone raped one of my daughters. It's easy to say we need to have a cool, calm, collected response. We need to reflect on it like Jacob here. He kept quiet. He thought about it. He wanted to wait until his sons came out from the fields so that he could counsel with them. If you and I knew that someone we loved was raped, our tendency would be to fly off the handle, become very verbal, and become very vengeful. That's exactly what Jacob's sons did. And so we see two responses here. Jacob is calm, cool, and collected if she in fact was raped. Or the brothers, on the other hand, they flew off the handle. Now, how about you? Whenever you've been wronged, what is your response? I know if you're a hothead, and you have that tendency and you're very aggressive, and some of you know this when you're in traffic. You fly off the handle if someone cuts you off. Some of you just take things as life comes. Well, obviously, God doesn't want us to engage in rage. So verse 6, then Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. Remember, his son was saying, get that girl for me to marry. I'm in love with her. And so Hamor finally says, okay, son. And they go over to where Jacob is, and they speak to him. Now, we don't know exactly what Hamor said to Jacob. He may have apologized if a rape did happen. He may have apologized to him, but probably not, because again, that was common practice in the Canaanite culture, and there's no indication in the text that Hamor apologized to Jacob for what happened to his daughter. He probably went there to arrange the marriage, and in verse 7 it says, now the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard of it. They caught wind of what had happened, and it says the men were grieved. In other words, they were saddened, but they probably were angry, and they probably said, I'm going to kill that, blah, 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 and whatever Hebrew profanity that they used. And they were very angry because he had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing ought not to be done. Again, both were unacceptable, rape or premarital sex. And you got to understand, they're angry because this is their only sister. This particular man violated their only sister. And if you know anything about brothers, brothers can be very protective with their sister. In fact, John even talked about that. He has 3 sons and 1 daughter, and he's talked about how his sons are very protective of their sister. Now, I don't have boys. I have all girls. But I can understand they're enraged because it's their sister. And furthermore, you know how it feels when somebody violates someone that you love. I have a friend, actually, he was my former worship leader at my other church. Someone burglarized his house. And I remember the look on his face when he told me. He says they took everything. And if you've ever been a victim of theft, you understand the feeling of someone coming into your house and taking your stuff. You feel a sense of violation. You can imagine how they felt knowing that their sister, if in fact she was raped, was violated. Now listen, their anger was legitimate. Their response was not. It's all right to be angry. The Bible talks about having a righteous anger when wickedness and sin are committed. But you see, where we fall into sin is we often retaliate. We often don't bury the hatchet, and what we do is we seek out our pound of flesh and we want retaliation. Listen, we ought to be angry at what is going on in our culture today. We ought to be incensed at the sin that is running amok in our society. We ought to be incensed of the fact that Faye Swetnick, a month ago, was brutally murdered. When you heard that story, you should have been incensed. You should be incensed and angry when you see all the abortions that are taking place in our culture. You ought to be incensed and angry when you see that traditional marriage is being attacked today by the homosexual agenda. You ought to be angry when you see that pornography is destroying families. You ought to be angry over the sex slave trade that is taking root in our culture. You ought to be angry, and I know many of you are, but you got to control your anger when you see the politics that is destroying this country. There is a place for righteous anger. Ephesians 4 says, be angry and do not what? Sin. But there's an unrighteous anger that seeks revenge. You say, Mike, what's the difference between righteous anger and unrighteous anger? Righteous anger seeks God's glory. Righteous anger is angry because God is being defamed and His laws are not being followed, and because people are flaunting their sin. You see, righteous anger is more over the glory of God. Unrighteous anger is more selfish. It is because I have been hurt. It is because I have been defamed. Now listen, don't confuse anger and self-defense. Listen, you and I can be angry over a situation, and we ought to be angry over sin, but that doesn't mean that when I say don't retaliate, I'm not saying don't defend yourself. You see, you could be angry, and someone's going to say, well, okay, be angry, but don't retaliate. That's true. God doesn't want us to have unrighteous anger by retaliating, but that doesn't mean we don't defend ourselves. For example, if someone is going to attack you and your family, you say, well, I'm righteously angered by that, but I'm not going to protect myself. No. In fact, a well-known preacher, you know who he is, John MacArthur, he told the story in the pulpit one time about this particular gentleman. I don't know who he is. I think he came to his church service, but he said he showed up at his house in the evening, and he knocked on the door, and he had a butcher knife in his hand. And he kept knocking on the door repetitively, saying that he wanted his younger daughter, Melinda, because he wanted to hack her into pieces. Now, John got righteously angered by that, but do you think he opened the door? You know what John said he did? He said he went and he grabbed a bat. And he told the man, if you don't leave the property, he says, I'm going to knock you into eternity. There is a sense of self-defense. And I know there's a fine line there. Well, let's pick up in verse 8. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, the soul of my son. Now this is Hamor speaking to Jacob and the brothers. He's saying, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Intermarry with us, give your daughter to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. Thus, verse 10, you shall live with us, and the land shall be open before you. Live and trade in it, and acquire property. He's saying, look, if you will intermarry with us by allowing your daughter to marry my son, we'll have good relationships with one another. We'll trade, we'll intermarry, and he's trying to sweeten the deal here to get them to give up Dinah in marriage. But what does the Bible say? God did not want Israel to intermarry with the people of Canaan. That's why Abraham sent to get a wife for Isaac, because he didn't want Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman. Why? Because it would destroy the line of Israel. It would convolute and it would pollute their religion. In fact, if you read Deuteronomy chapter 7, God made it very clear that they were not to intermarry with the people of the land because it would corrupt their pure faith. And again, you and I need to apply this principle. The Bible says we're to be in the world, but we're not to be of the world. We got to live in this world. We got to reflect Christ. We got to buy. We got to sell. We got to do a lot of things that the world does, but we're not to take on the moral character of this world. And I know there's a fine line there because Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7 that we're to use the things of this world, but he says we're not to become engrossed in them. And you and I can intermarry with the world. We can become materialistic like the world. We can become sexually immoral like the world. Listen, the church today, 50 to 60% of people in the church are divorced. Now, I'm not here to get on you if you're divorced. Maybe you weren't at fault. Maybe you were at fault. And listen, God forgives divorce. But I'm simply saying, in most of the categories, the church today is no different than the world. And that's sad. Most of the church today looks just like the world. And so what the church has done is we've prostituted ourselves by intermarrying with the world. And obviously this means that if you're single, don't date or marry a non-believer. You've heard that message many times in this pulpit. Notice verse 11. Shechem also said to her father, Jacob, now he's going to step in. His dad spoke up for him. Now he's going to speak up because he really wants her. Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, if I find favor in your sight, then I will give you whatever you say to me. Just tell me what you want. I'll give it to you because I really want this woman. By the way, this again seems to indicate that it may not have been rape, it may have been consensual sex. Verse 12, ask me ever so much bridal payment and gift. In other words, tell me what you want. I'll give you whatever bridal payment you want and gift, and I will give according to as you say to me, but give me the girl in marriage. He is desperate. He's willing to do anything. And listen, if it was consensual sex, and he was in fact in love with her, you and I know that love knows no bounds. But Jacob's sons answered Shechem in verse 13 and his father Hamor with deceit because he had defiled Dinah their sister. Now here's the question, where is Jacob in this whole process? Because it says Jacob's sons answered Shechem. It seems like at this point Jacob had removed himself from this whole discussion. He may have been angry if a rape did happen, and he may have removed himself. And you know what he did here if he did? He abdicated leadership. He should have been the one to take leadership here, not to let his hothead sons who are in their 20s, who basically have tempers, he should have been able to control the situation, but the indication is he was not here or he was passive. He went along with what his sons wanted. And notice here it says that they're going to agree to Shechem's terms, but they're basically going to deceive him. And what does the Bible say? Sons are just like the father. Do you remember Jacob? He was a heel grabber. In the previous chapters, he is called a deceiver. And so what happens is the sins of the fathers often gets passed down to the next generation. Now, this doesn't automatically mean that you are doomed to repeat the sins of your parents, but it does say this, that we as parents have to be careful what we model to our children, because if we model ungodly behavior, and listen, all of us inevitably, we are going to model for our children the good and the bad, because none of us are perfect. We're all sinners. And so our kids are going to pick up sometimes habits that we regret. But we need to be very intentional about what we pass down to our children. And you know what else this says to us? We got to be careful, unlike the brothers here, that we don't deceive other people willfully. They're putting on a front that they want to engage in this covenant with the Shechemites, and they want to give their sister, but basically they're forming a ruse. And so ostensibly, they appear that they're in agreement, but in their hearts, they really have ulterior motives. And you know, as Christians, we got to be careful that we don't tell people one thing, but in our hearts, we are willfully deceiving other people. Have you ever got some of those calls on the phone where people pretend to be something that they're not, and basically they're trying to do you out of money? I remember years ago, I got an IRS call, supposedly. And this person on the other end of the line kept calling, and they would leave a message saying the IRS needs more information, blah, blah, blah. I knew it was a scam. And so finally I got tired of it, and I went ahead and I dialed the number, and I called the guy, and he picked up the phone. And I said, I played kind of like I was ignorant, and I said to him, what is it you want? What is it the IRS wants? And so he went on, and I said to him this. I said, first of all, you're a liar. And I said, you are a deceptive person. And I said, what you're doing is wrong to other people because you are pretending that you are legitimate, but really on the inside, you are preying on other people. And I said this to him in very strong terms. I said, you need to get right with God. Or I said, you're going to be under the judgment of God. I said, you need to get right. And I started to preach the gospel to him. Click. He didn't want to hear it. Well, let's see what happens. Where are we at on time? I don't have a clock up here again. I'll keep going for an hour. What time is it? What time? Okay, 7:30. Thank you. All right, verse 14. Here's their ruse. They said to them, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to the one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. In other words, we can't let our sister marry you because you guys are uncircumcised. We're circumcised. We're part of the covenant with the nation of Israel. God gave us this. And so in verse 15, only on this condition will we consent to you if you will become like us in that every male of you be circumcised. Then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters for ourselves, and we will live with you and become one people. He says, we'll enter into this under one condition. Verse 17, but if you will not listen to us to be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and we will go. That was the terms. You got to be circumcised. Now their words, verse 18, seemed reasonable to Hamor and Shechem, Hamor's son. The young man did not delay to do the thing because he was delighted with Jacob's daughter. Listen, he was willing to be circumcised as an adult because he really wanted her. Now, he was more respected than all the household of his father. And what that means is simply this: he had influence. So if Shechem and the father, who were basically in positions of leadership, if they said, we're going to get circumcised, that meant their whole tribe was going to be circumcised. So Hamor, verse 20, and his son Shechem came to the gate of their city and spoke to the men. That's where the leaders of the elders came together to make decisions. And here's what they said to them. These men are friendly with us, that is the Israelites. Therefore, let them live in the land and trade in it. For behold, the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters in marriage and give our daughters to them. Only on this condition will the men consent to us to live with us, to become one people. And here's the condition that these particular individuals presented to the elders at the gate. Every male among us be circumcised as they are circumcised. Now listen, that is a hard sell. If I'm an adult and I'm uncircumcised, and somebody comes to me and says, hey, we want to make a treaty with these people, but here's the condition. You got to have your foreskin cut off. What do you think you're going to say as an adult male? Listen, dude, I don't care how much you're in love with that woman, I'm not getting cut. It's not going to happen. But look what they did in order to manipulate them. Will not their livestock, verse 23, and their property and all their animals be ours? You see how they manipulated them? They knew they wouldn't buy it. What they did was they appealed to them on the basis of greed. If we can enter into a covenant with them, they are a small tribe. Our tribe is much bigger, and so what will happen is if we intermarry, we'll end up taking all their goods. They said, only let us consent to them, and they will live with us. And in verse 24, it says, all who went out of the gate of the city listened to Hamor and to his son Shechem, and every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of his city. And so all of them were circumcised. Now, I'm not going to show you pictures here because obviously that's inappropriate, and I don't have pictures. But here is something of the knives that they used. This is typically was the flint knife in that day. Now today, we have more modern forms of ways of doing it. Now listen, if you're a child, it's one thing to be circumcised 8 days after you're born. But to be circumcised as an adult, I mean, when I read that, I was like, oh shit, mama. I was like, man. Verse 25, now it came about on the third day when they were in pain. This is like having hernia surgery. That two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi. Why Simeon and Levi? Well, notice it says they're Dinah's brother through Leah. So they had more invested here because they were related to them in a more intimate way because of Leah. It says, while they were in pain, each took his sword and came up on the city unawares and killed every male. They can't get up. They can't defend themselves. They're hurting. And it says they killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the edge of the sword, and they took Dinah from Shechem's house. Now here's a question. Why was Dinah at Shechem's house? See, this may lend to the fact that it was consensual. There was not a rape involved. That's what some people argue. Others would say, no, she was already married to him. Because remember, that was the agreement. If they got circumcised, so probably they had the ceremony, and then they were circumcised, and here she is at the house. So once Simeon and Levi, we don't know if the other brothers were party to this, if they went in and they actually helped out. They probably did. And what do? They kill all the men, and they take basically Dinah from Shechem's house, and they went forward. Now you say, why did they do this? Isn't this somewhat of an overkill? It is, because if rape occurred, the Bible did not permit this. Shechem should have been punished. But you know what the two sons did, Simeon and Levi? They engaged in overkill. And this is exactly what God prevented in the Old Testament. As you read the Old Testament later on, he enacted a law, you've heard of this, an eye for an eye and what? Tooth for tooth. Lex talionis. Why did God give that? The reason he gave it was so that there wouldn't be an overkill when it comes to vengeance or punishment. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This was overkill. But let me tell you why. In Hebrew culture, they probably killed not only Shechem and his father, but the whole town as well. The reason they did it is because they saw the town as complicit with what Shechem had done. You got to understand, in that culture, they thought in terms of corporate solidarity. They looked at things holistically. Do you remember in the Bible when Achan stole the booty and he hid it in his tent? What happened? God not only killed Achan and his wife, but his whole what? His whole family. Or how about this illustration? Adam and Eve. When Adam and Eve sinned, they corrupted the whole human race. And I've had people say to me, well, that's not fair. But you have to understand that Adam and Eve represented the human race. So they acted as power of attorney. When Adam and Eve sinned, they blew it for the whole human race. And so the reason why Levi and Simeon may have gone in and killed everybody is because they saw the Shechemites as complicit with what Shechem had done. And you see, their anger led to murder. And that was wrong. In fact, one person said this, and I quote, "A vigilante mentality always insists that the answer to violence is more violence," end quote. You see, what they did was they were wronged by violence, and so they dispensed it out, and they gave violence as well. But you know what the Bible says we're to do with our anger? The Bible says that we are to forgive. Now, I'm not saying that if somebody has broken the law and they have raped somebody that you know, or they've raped a loved one, or they have done something reprehensible, that you are just to be angry and you're to let it go. No, the Bible says that if somebody has violated the law, you are to forgive them, but you are also to apply the law to their life. You're not to take matters into your own hands, but what you're to do is you're basically to commit them to the laws of the land. So if, God forbid, someone raped one of my daughters, I would be angry and I would want to seek out personal vengeance, but God says not to do that. So here's what I would do. I would get the law involved. That's perfectly biblical. What God says not to do is to take your shotgun, go to the person's house, and kill them, even though that would be a normal, natural response in the flesh to do that. Well, in verse 27, as we wind down, it says this. Jacob's sons came upon the slain and looted the city because they had defiled their sister. They took their flocks and their herds. Now, they're going beyond just killing all the people. Notice they're raping the land of Shechem. They took their flocks and their herds, their donkeys, and that which was in the city, and that which was in the field, and they captured and looted all their wealth, and all their little ones and their wives, even all that was in the houses. Notice the progression of their crime. You see, they allowed anger to get the best of them. Rather than controlling their anger, they decided that they wanted to seek personal vengeance. And so, notice their sins. It went from anger to deception to murder, and now it leads to greed, because what do? They pillaged the whole area. See, this wasn't a proper response, whether it was rape or whether it was premarital sex. And so in verse 30, then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me odious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites, the Perizzites, and my men being few in number. They will gather together against me and attack me, and I will be destroyed, I and my household." Jacob here is incensed. Why? Because he's saying, look, you've made us now vulnerable to the other tribes of the land of Canaan, and this is going to be offensive to them, and they're going to attack me, and furthermore, it hurts my reputation. Some think that Jacob was more concerned about his reputation than necessarily his daughter here, but notice what the sons said to their father in verse 31. But they said, "Should he treat our sister as a harlot?" The chapter ends with a question. By the way, there's only one other book in the Old Testament where the chapter ends with a question. Does anybody know what book that is? It is the book of Jonah. And what are they saying here when they say to their father, "Should he treat our sister as a harlot?" What they're saying is, basically, they got what they deserved. We were justified in what we did. And so here's the question tonight as we close. Do you have someone that you're angry towards? Someone that you want to seek revenge on? Somebody that's wronged you? You'll probably never kill them. But do you fantasize about killing them? Do you fantasize about verbally assassinating them? The Bible says we are to forgive if somebody wrongs us. If somebody violates the law while they hurt us, then it's not wrong for you to allow the law to run its course. Forgiveness doesn't mean you don't allow the law to take place. If a man divorces his wife, she can forgive him, but she has every right biblically to take him to court for child support. But here's what God doesn't want us to do. He doesn't want us to take vengeance into our own hands. Let me read these last couple of verses and then we'll close. Here is what God says when it comes to personal vengeance. Romans chapter 12. Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men, if possible, so far as it depends on you. What does it say? Be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." But if your enemy is hungry, rather than seeking vengeance, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink, for in so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Let me ask you a question. Is that a tall order? Absolutely. Don't retaliate. You say, "But you don't understand what they did to me." Let me say it again. If they violated the law, let the law run its course. If they did not violate the law and it's a personal matter, you need to commit it to God and you need to forgive them. And you know what? That's not always easy. Sometimes that's a process, because the deeper the hurt, the harder it is to forgive that person and let it go. Let God deal with them. You say, "Yeah, but God often takes his time." Well, listen, God will deal with it in his own way. You say, "Yeah, but what if they get saved?" Listen, you've had that thought. What if they get saved? Then I'll never get my vengeance. Well, listen, what if God had that attitude towards you? One other verse, Luke 6. "But I say to you who hear, love your enemies and do good to those who" what? "Hate you. Bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Whoever hits you on the cheek, offer him the other also. Whoever takes away your coat, do not withhold your shirt from him either. Give to everyone who asks of you, and whoever takes away what is yours, do not demand it back. Now, Jesus here is using hyperbole. This is not literal language. If somebody slaps me on the face, I don't go up to him and say, ooh, hit the other side as well. If someone takes my car, I don't go and say, hey, my wife's got a car too. Do you want the keys to that? Jesus here is using hyperbole, and he's saying that our forgiveness and our grace needs to be magnanimous towards other people because it's what distinguishes us from pagans. He says, treat others the same way you want them to treat you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that? For even sinners love those who love them. I mean, look, if you love somebody else and they love you in return, we're no different than sinners. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same thing. If you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners in order to receive back the same amount. But watch the distinction here. Here's what makes Christians different. But love your enemies. The world doesn't do that. The world doesn't forgive. The world has a dirty, hairy mentality, a Schwarzenegger mentality. I would be back. He says, love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High God. Listen, we are more like God when we forgive other people who wrong us, because doesn't God show mercy to those who wrong him? He says, you will be sons of the Most High, for he himself is kind to the ungrateful and evil men. Be merciful just as your Father is what? Merciful. You say, Mike, I'm not there spiritually. And listen, I understand. It's not always easy to forgive people who have hurt you and wronged you. Especially if someone mistreats somebody that you love and they do something very damaging. It is very difficult. And you know what? I marvel at people who are in courtrooms, who are Christians, who forgive the person who murdered their child or their spouse. I marvel at that. But you know what? The world takes note of that. Why? Because they see a distinction. Because the world doesn't do that. That's what makes us distinct as Christians. So start in your home. If your spouse says something to you that you don't like, don't retaliate. Try that one. Start there. Start in your home and then work on other things and have an attitude of forgiveness. Let's pray.